Hey, and good morning. We're live. We made it. Whew. Wouldn't be a Friday without a little bit of technical difficulty. Isn't that right, Austin?
That is correct. That is correct.
So good morning, everybody. Welcome. You made it through the week. And if you're watching, this is Food Safety Chat Live, and this is a show we do on LinkedIn and YouTube every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time in chilly, snowy, last I checked, 7-degree Fahrenheit, Colorado, where Austin and I are both located. If you're like Cheryl in the Midwest, I would imagine this is coming your way if it's not there already. So hopefully you're warm. So like most things in this world, technical difficulties are just part of life. So thank you everybody for putting up with that and waiting for the chat. And so we are now live. So if you're new to this, right, what you're going to notice is that this is not a presentation. This is not a bunch of PowerPoint slides. This is a discussion around topics that impact us all in the world of quality assurance and food safety for manufacturing. And every week I bring on a special guest, an expert in the area, who comes in to talk about a topic. And one of the things that you'll notice as we've been doing these live streams is that there's generally you can count on one of two categories for these conversations. The first is technical skills, how to audit, these type of things, relative to being a successful quality assurance professional. The other side of that is, in my opinion, Austin, even more important than that is the people side of things and how you actually interact with others and how you get things done. Because you can be the most gifted, the smartest QA person, you know everything, and you've got the codes memorized and everything. But if you're unable to work with other people and get things done with them, you're not going to be successful. Oh, so it looks like Tim got his snow this morning, so 6 inches there in Minneapolis.
Hey,
oh, look at that.
Anya. I met her out at in Dubai.
Nice. Yeah. So Austin, if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, definitely. And so Austin Welch, look him up. Had a fascinating experience of going out and speaking last week at a conference in Dubai. And so it sounds like that went pretty good, huh?
Went great. Yeah. And actually the topic we're going to be talking about today is similar to what the session that we did out in Dubai. So if you missed Dubai, then you're here today.
There you go. And so Marcel, good to see you. Ryan, Frank's here this morning. Rocky Ford, Food Safety Consulting. Nice. Colder in Wisconsin, absolutely. And Darshan in Toronto, welcome. So glad everybody's here. So one of the things that you'll notice with this as well is this is interactive, right? So ask us questions. We'll work the questions into the conversation. And I'm guessing on today's topic, there's going to be a lot of questions. So fire away. We're happy to answer those. That's why we're here. Also, what's kind of cool on this too is you'll notice that if you're new to this, we've built a really cool community here of people who are able to attend and invest in this hour on building skills and getting better at what you do. So get to know the people you're in the chat with and join in the conversation because we love it. So today is, it's interesting, isn't it? It's I almost jumped into the topic. Everybody join us. Very good. Very good. What are you drinking today, Austin?
Today it's coffee, but I've moved to half calf, half decaf because I've been realizing I'm a little too amped up by lunchtime.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Right? Yeah, you can be too caffeinated, that's for sure. And when you're in that state, I mean, it's nothing gets done on that side either. So yeah, definitely.
It's just manic.
Because you just yeah, exactly. So one of the sayings, Austin, that we hear a lot of times in plants and even at corporate, right, is, hey guys, as management team, we want to know what's going on, right? So if you see something, you need to say something, right? It makes for a pithy little saying, but does it really work in reality?
Right. And I mean, and that's the overarching kind of theme of what I was hoping to talk about today. And it's a topic that I've been fascinated with for a long time, going back before I was even in the food industry. When I was designing anti-harassment trainings for companies, we were always looking at the soft skill aspect of anti-harassment, not just the compliance aspect, but like how do we actually shift behavior? And that was something that we really started looking into was, creating these cultures or the environments of bystanders. So as opposed to trying to specifically target and prevent harassment, which is very hard to do because there's a very small percentage of people who actually engage in that behavior, but there's a much larger group of people who don't, who can witness it and say something about it, step in and be an active bystander. And so that same research really kind of applies within what we're talking about right now, which is when we're looking at health and safety and quality, to see something, say something, create those bystanders who will do that. The issue is that simply being told, if you see something, say something, rarely translates into a new behavior. And that's because there's many psychological and sociological restrictions that we have to speaking up, right? It's kind of a risk versus reward on whether or not I'm going to say something, because anytime I do intervene, there's a potential risk involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because I mean, geez, we see, Austin, these gigantic food safety issues that are out there, right? I mean, just top of mind, we've been following the Jif peanut butter situation, where there was environmental hits, salmonella in the environment, right? So peanuts are susceptible to that. They were going on for a decade, and they couldn't get it out of the plant. And now reports have come out that management knew that it was there and it was in product. Luckily, nobody got sick that we know of at this point, and nothing happened, right? Bluebell ice cream in Texas, right? Giant issue there. And even when you're in the midst of it, right, you think, man, maybe it's not that big of a deal. Of course, Abbott with infant formula, right, causing a gigantic problem, right? You can go on and on and on. And every year, this is a question in food safety that we hear all the time is, gosh, pretty much every year, the number of illnesses and the number of deaths that occur from food safety poisoning and food safety issues is about the same. And everybody goes, why? Why can't we reduce this number? It's always up there, and nothing that we do seems to work. And I think when we were, deciding on our topic for today's conversation is, I think it's that psychological factor, right? And for me, and I would imagine, let me know in the comments here if you guys see, similar scenarios in your operations, right? Is, somebody who's on the floor, right? You're going to start picking up cues, and the most important person out there is your boss, right? Your supervisor or whatever you're doing. And if that person isn't following up on whatever it is that you see, they're not going to do it, right? They may say something once or twice, right? So if I'm operating a machine and it's making a weird noise, and I tell the supervisor, and the supervisor goes, right? Just keep running, whatever, right? Half hour to end a shift, I want to go home. You're going to mention it once, maybe twice. And if you get the same reaction, that's it. You're done. You're like, oh, okay. They say one thing, but they really don't mean it, right? And so that kind of, as I refer to, kind of like a hidden factory, boy, if that happens, it's death, right? Because as a quality manager, you have no idea these things are going on.
And that gets back to like when we look at the definition of food safety culture, right? So it's, values, beliefs, and norms, and what you just explained is a norm, right? The norm is if we're 30 minutes prior to the shift change and there's an issue, we're going to just kind of slough it off to the next guy.
Yeah.
And so that becomes part of that culture, that now that is a norm within that culture. And you were talking about, that information making its way up, and it reminds me of heard of like the iceberg of ignorance,
yeah,
right? Which I wish I would have given you a picture of that as well to show. But right, you have the top leadership up here, and they only get, I can't remember what the percentage is, 9% of the total information. But down, as you move down to the base of the iceberg, and here is the front line, and they see everything, right? They have 100% of the information, but it goes through layers of trickle, where it's getting filtered out of either what's important or what am I willing to talk about. And so that, one of the big questions that I started looking into when looking into why people don't speak up, is trying to figure out why is this a thing? Because the more information, more like metacognition we have around why we behave the way that we behave, then it becomes easier for us to start to implement those behavioral changes, because now we are aware of what's like those restrictions are. And so a lot of the research that I utilize in, like I said, in quality and safety comes from what we know from anti-harassment training. So it's really just translating that into this new space. And there's some really cool research on this. And there was a paper written called to Act or Not to Act. And it specifically looked into what is necessary for somebody to speak up, right? And it basically comes down to these internal questions that have to be answered in the affirmative. I have to be able to say yes to these questions if I'm going to act. And I sent you an image of kind of that breakdown. So yeah, if you want to pull that up, we can show that.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, look at that. All right.
Hey, so the first question that we all ask ourselves when we see something that seems off or not right or hazardous or risky or anything like that, the first internal question is, does the situation require action, right? Do I understand what I'm seeing here? Do I understand the context? Do I have the capability, right? Am I knowledgeable enough to be able to, assess that this is an actual issue? I have to be able to answer yes to that first question. And so this comes down to things around, training and development and creating this environment where people realize that if they see something and it seems off, then yes, undoubtedly you need to say something about it. So does the situation require action? If I answer yes to that, I go, yep, that is definitely a problem. And the next question that I'm asking myself is it my personal responsibility to act? And this is an interesting one, because this is where we get into hierarchy, right? And whether or not I am in a role to say something or should manage, or do I believe that, well, that's management's job, right? My job is to, put the jar on or put the cap on, and that's it, right? That's my job. Right. And so creating this culture where I'm able to answer that question in the affirmative as well, which is that it is my personal responsibility to act. It's not,
sorry.
That's all right. It's, that I can't diffuse responsibility. Right. And this is what we see in a lot of situations, right? Is that historically, if there's a crowd of people standing around a problematic situation, the intuition is that, well, if no one else has said anything, or, then everything should be fine. I don't want to be the outcast, right? I don't want to be the one to bring up the issue. It's like, if everybody else is looking at it and they're saying it's fine, then it must be fine. That's that social cue. That's that norm that we talk about in the culture. But then there's also the belief, and this is the diffusion of responsibility aspect, where it's like, well, someone else will take charge, right? Someone else will take care of this, and hoping or assuming that somebody else will take control of the situation. And so we're looking to create these cultures where people don't have that bias, where they assume that nobody has said anything and it's my job to say something. And then the third and kind of final question is, should I take action now or should I take action later? Right? Does this necessitate an immediate stoppage, or is this something that I can go to my, that I can go to my leadership team and say, like, hey, there's an issue over here on this machine. It's going to need to be serviced in the next 2 weeks to a month. So kind of qualifying the severity of the issue. And so those are so it's a very simple framework, but for me, when I saw this the first time, it was like a massive light bulb going on, because I was like, oh, okay. Because I realized that I do this. whenever I see something.
Yeah.
And so starting to look at the world and assess my own behavior and my own bias and my own cognitive shortcuts that I take, that we all do, and starting to go through this step, right? Does it require action? Is it my personal responsibility to act? And should I do something now or later? And this is so this is like a great framework to really start to build that bystander model. So does all that make sense? And is there any?
Yeah, and so what I was kind of going through in my head as we're talking about this applies. I mean, so our specific conversation relative to food manufacturing and food safety, absolutely, but life, right? So, for example, you're driving down the road and you see a car wreck, right?
Yep, that is exactly it.
The first thing in your head is, oh my goodness, how awful, right? And you start looking at it and you start in your mind assessing, how serious was it? Is this a fender bender? Are people walking around? Are they okay? Should I intervene, right? And you're trying to figure that piece out. And if it looks like a really bad wreck, the first thing you're looking for is, oh my goodness, is the ambulance here? Do I, and then you're going through that decision-making process of, okay, do I stop? Yes or no? And then if you stop, then your mind is already going to that next step of, okay, are people going to require assistance? Gosh, I haven't had CPR training in a long time.
Yeah.
Am I going to be okay? Do I have a first aid kit in my car, right? All these things start going through your mind. You're like, am I prepared? Does this require action? And what's kind of interesting about this too, is one of the things I've always enjoyed, learning more about as well. And this applies in this area too, Austin, is philosophy, right? Because as human beings, we are constantly going through three questions in our mind. And it really applies to this as well, right? Is what is it? How do I know? And what do I need to do? Right. So we're constantly, our minds, we're hardwired for that, right? Because if we look back at our ancient, caveman ancestors, right, you have to be really, really good at that, or you're going to end up as dinner, right?
Right. What is it?
Yeah. What is that? Oh, it's a tiger. Well, how do I know? I've seen those guys before. They're dangerous. Okay, great. What do? I get the heck out of here, right? And figuring those things out is super important. And does the situation require action? I think this gets back to what Felix is talking about here in the comments, which is great comments, is if you have it in your head and you've been taught that your job is to run a machine. Right? That's the way I run the machine. No, your job is to make safe, wholesome food for people, right? Yep. And you need to open up that context. And then that personal responsibility to act becomes something that you can link up to. But if in your mind is, my job is to run this machine and my job is to run this machine for the entire shift and that's success and I'm rewarded for that. If you deviate from that, now you're getting into that second one. Oh my goodness, right? If I do act, there's going to be repercussions, right? My boss is going to be mad. And nothing matters more than my supervisor.
Yeah, and so this kind of leads into the next aspect, which is, well, how do we create the environment where people are able to answer these questions in the affirmative, where they're able to say, does the situation require action? I'm able to answer yes. And is it my personal responsibility to act? And I'm able to answer yes. And what's interesting about this doesn't just apply to frontline, right? I mean, middle management has these same issues. Top level management, because you're always answering to somebody. There's always going to be somebody else that you have to answer to for your decisions. So this kind of transcends, where you are within the pecking order. We all kind of do this, but one of the great things, there's a book called The Fearless Organization. And it was written by Amy Edmondson, and she's been doing research on this topic of psychological safety for the past, 20, 30 years now. And when she talks about psychological safety, that phrase, basically, psychological safety means that you are empowered, you feel empowered to be able to speak up about an issue without fear of repercussion. Right. That we can bring our whole self to work. We can share ideas and innovations and bring up issues that are obvious to us, that might not be obvious to others, and not fear that there will be repercussions for that. Yeah. So within her research, that's, so I kind of started blending the psychological safety model in with the bystander intervention model, because the bystander intervention model by itself, it's like, well, it tells me what needs to happen, right? But I don't know how to actually go about, creating this environment. And that's where I think the psychological safety research really comes into play, because creating an environment where someone is able to say, it is my personal responsibility to act, that gets into the culture aspect and those norms and those beliefs of like, I believe that I do more than just, pack up the shipment, but that I am packing up, I'm making sure that we're producing safe food for everybody.
Right.
So in the so there's a second slide, and it's really interesting. And so this kind of breaks down, and I should give the link to Amy's book because it's amazing. But I would highly recommend. It's called The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, and it's fascinating stuff. She does a lot of research also within the healthcare field, because we see a lot of issues. Hierarchy is very important within the healthcare field. And so once again, you have your frontline, a lot of the nurses who identify issues, but then it's like, well, am I going to bring it up to the doctor or the surgeon or anything like that? Yeah. Are we in an environment where I'm safe to do that?
What was the name of the book again? Here, I'll pull it up and put the link in.
The Fearless Organization.
There we go.
So
good old Amazon.
So this is a picture from her book, where she kind of like, after she sets everything up and explains what psychological safety is, she provides a lot of case studies, but then she talks about, well, here is what the leader's toolkit for building psychological safety. And so she kind of breaks it down into these three things that help to create this sense of psychological safety within a team. And so the first category, right, she calls it setting the stage. So frame the work, right? Set expectations about failure, uncertainty, and interdependence to clarify the need for voice and emphasize purpose. So identify what's at stake, why it matters, and for whom. Completely translates to food safety, right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about setting expectations, it's setting the expectation of, what your job entails, right? That your job is not just this one thing. And so we do this a lot with the work we do at Sage Media, right? I'm creating a training program around the importance of food safety for, VP level and up. And these are people in HR, finance, mergers and acquisition. These are not people who typically think of food safety on a day-to-day basis, because their structure is built upon, how many companies did I buy this quarter, or what was I able to do on the P&L, or how many people did I recruit? So part of the training that we do around this topic of food safety culture is to frame the work, right? Yeah. The only reason we are buying more companies and mergers and acquisition is because we want to grow and be able to produce more safe food for people. The reason that we are hiring more people is because we need to ensure the safety of our food. So framing the work, not just in that departmental aspect, but in the larger goal of the company.
Mm-hmm. So really, so earlier we were talking about a line worker, right? And setting up the proper foundation for that, and, getting rid of the, it's not my job. And really you just described it's not my job at a higher level, right? Mm-hmm. So the head of procurement is saying, food safety, that's not my job. Let those guys worry about it.
Exactly. And set expectations about failure. And this is something that you've talked about in the past, right? Which is, if you set a zero tolerance for pathogens, and you create a incentivized system to not find anything, then you're not going to find anything. But if you set expectations about failure and say that, like, hey, like finding those issues it's not a failure. That's a win because we found it. Right. And so I always talk about these slight shifts in thinking, right? It's not a radical shift. It's just like, oh, we're going to look at it from a different angle now. And then getting back into, the emphasizing purpose, identify what's at stake. And I think a lot of companies already do this really well. They identify what's at stake and be able to, they're trying to convey the importance of food safety, but create those, emotional messages to really kind of drive it home of what is truly at stake here. It's not just a recall because, they cost us money, but we're looking at, long-term illness issues, how that affects families, how a death would affect the family forever. Yeah. So really setting up what's at stake there.
Huh. Well, and we see this all through our lives too, Austin, right? Is, children watch what we do, right? And, as parents, it's something that people struggle with all the time. And, even if you don't have children, you remember that when you were a child, right? If your parents weren't doing what they said you should do, right? It's like the parent who smokes or whatever, hey, don't smoke, it's bad for you. And they're smoking. It's like, really, right? Is that lesson actually going to sink in? No, right? You have to frame that appropriately and setting those expectations. Part of it too, right, is a really good way to look at knowledge gaps and things in your life is there's kind of two different views on this. Is people will go, oh God, I'm so stupid, I don't know that. That same situation, other people will look at it and say, oh, this is amazing. This is something I didn't know. I can now improve and grow, right? Mm-hmm. Cool, I found something new, right? And it's all in that framing. It's the same thing.
Yeah, and that's, I was telling my wife this morning, I do photography, and I print these pictures out, and then I bleach them, and then I kind of use this ink to paint the image back on. And I told her, I was like, I love the feeling of having all of these ready to go pictures because it's possibility, right? And half of them are going to wind up in the trash, and the other half will hopefully be decent.
Yeah. Well, on that side too, right, is successful people are successful because they fail far more than anyone else, right? They just keep going and doing those things and learning and growing, and they just move on, right? So framing of this is super, super important. And one of the things I would always do, and I've mentioned this on here before as well, right, is setting up that frame of, and what I would say to people in my responsibility and others as well, is that if you're not comfortable taking this food right off the line and going home and giving it to your grandchildren without a second thought, we're doing something wrong, right? And if that's the case, I need to know, right? And that was a variant of kind of what we're talking about here, right? And I didn't even know it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see a question from Felix. Is needing to ask if it is my responsibility to act counterproductive to this discussion? No, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So we want people to be able to say that it is my responsibility to act. Right. That's the culture, the environment that we're hopefully creating. But then, with the second column or category, right, is the inviting participation. So demonstrate situational humility. And this is a big one, right? If I'm a leader who always has all the right answers and knows everything, right? In what way would you feel empowered to bring something to me? Bring up, because I already know everything.
Yeah.
And, so part of that leading by example in the leadership role, and we're all in leadership roles of some sort. And, it doesn't matter where we really fall in the pecking order. There's usually some form of leadership that we have. And so demonstrating that situational humility and acknowledging that I don't always have the right answers. That's why we have teams, is that like we are stronger as a group than as one individual player. There's not one superstar who's going to find every single safety issue that's out there. But that requires a long tail leadership strategy, right? To continually, and this is what we talk about within training, right? I can't do one training and expect to shift culture, shift organizational, do an organizational change program. These are multi-year initiatives. And it's, part of it begins with teaching the leaders how to behave in a way so that people feel comfortable bringing up these issues. And the way that I feel comfortable is by having a leader who shows me that, like, hey, I don't always have the right answers. I don't always know. Like, bring the stuff to me.
Yeah. There was a fantastic plant manager in my past who his people skills were off the charts, and they would bring him to different plants to help improve those plants. And what was interesting was he would work on the people side of things first, and then the production improvement would naturally follow. Mm-hmm. And I was in his office one time, and a supervisor came in the office, panicked, and says, "Oh, Don, we have a huge problem." And he sits back, keeps a calm demeanor, and says, "Okay, well, tell me about that." And the supervisor explains the situation, and he's speaking a million miles an hour, right? Everything's going to blow up, really. And it's like, okay. And by the time he finished his story, I knew what to do, and Don knew what to do. But what he did stuck with me. He said, that's a big issue. What do you recommend we do? And the supervisor said, I think we should do this. And Don said, "You're absolutely right, 100%. Go do that, please." And that empowerment was amazing, right? And so he was pushing responsibility down and empowering his team to make those decisions, right? Conversely, right, if you're one of those people, and I think there's, that's kind of an Achilles heel in the quality area, right, is we want to hold on to everything. And if you do that, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? Because you're not teaching your team and you're not sharing those values, and it's just absolutely destructive, right? You have to show that even if you know it, that you're willing to demonstrate. And I love that word humility in that second line there, right? Uh-huh. Is deferring and saying, what do you think we should do? Because conversely, the other side of this is you're teaching people that they can bring their problems to you, and it becomes your problem, right? And some people say, okay, sweet, I don't have to worry about that now, right? And they just, they wash their hands of it and they go back to what they were doing because now you've taken their problem, right? Which is very destructive.
Yeah. Well, and what you were just talking about with that one leader kind of directly falls into this next thing: practice inquiry, right? So ask good questions and model intense listening. So that's exactly what he did. He was like, what do you think should happen? And then, so he asked the question, but then he listened to the solution that the supervisor had before saying, yes, go forth and do that. So he modeled that intense listening process and was like, yep, you got it. Go forth and do good.
Yeah. Well, and even the little things behind the scenes, as you think about this, the guy came in the office, right? He kind of paused a little bit at the door and he came right in, right? He was kind of looking at who was in there, right? So there was no fear of going and presenting this information to his boss, right? So that supervisor had no fear of reprisal. If Don had handled it differently and was a bad leader, he would have immediately turned around and said, well, why'd you let that happen? And started attacking him, right?
Right.
And then that supervisor would have figured out pretty quickly, oh crap, that was no fun. I'm like, and then that information flow would have stopped really fast.
Right. And so once again, this guy's perfectly lines up the next step, which is the setup structures and processes. So, creating forums for input, having that, like, truly having that open door policy. Like, a lot of people say that they have an open door policy, but I mean, is that always true? No. And it goes back to, like, it's easy to say I have an open door policy. It's easy to say, if you see something, say something, right? That's not what leadership does. We don't just say pithy things and then hope for the best. Like, we have to create the environment in which that actually is a reality, that I actually have an open door policy and that you're more than welcome to come in and bring me any issue. And so creating those forums for input, whether it is the open door policy, a anonymous, information box, we're seeing more and more companies doing that, because, when these things don't happen, when we don't have these conversations, then it turns into a whistleblower situation, which at that point, it's like all systems failed. And now someone, it was so egregious that someone needed to blow the whistle on it. And that's what we're really trying to prevent. We don't want to get to that point.
Yeah, exactly. And there have been situations in the past, right, where if you're a frustrated quality manager and things aren't getting done and you see serious problems, a lot of times what they'll resort to is during an audit, they'll pull the auditor aside and say, you
Ooh.
know, it'd be really good if you find this.
Oh, that's
Right?
brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yes, and you know, providing guidelines for discussion, like, you know, don't rely on the people on the people to figure out how to create these forums of discussion. Like, actually create that for them. You know, so we're seeing with a lot of companies, they're using Slack channels now to create these, you know, group forums. We see a lot of like toolbox meetings, which is great, right? So it's like it's the daily kickoff or the weekly meeting where everybody has a chance to come together and kind of voice, you know, any particular concerns that they might have. So finding ways to create those environments where discussion is just inherent within it, so that it doesn't have to be this like big to do. If I want to bring up something, it's like, well, I bring it up in the meeting, right? Because the meeting's already there, it's already in place, we're ready to go. So how do we make it as easy as possible for them to be able to, like, it's going back to those questions, right? Does it require action? Am I the person to take said action?
Yeah.
So, and then what that accomplishes, you know, and it says down at that bottom line there, what it accomplishes is confidence that voice is welcome.
Yeah.
Right. Because if we can't create that confidence within the employee, then they're not gonna speak up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as Dean says here, fear. Yeah, fear. And part of this too, right, is, and this is why these things are so nuanced, right? And to kind of the comments that Felix is making here as well too, this is not a checklist, right? You don't have a food safety culture audit checklist that you pass or fail. It's going to be different for every company. And also remember too that people are different. You have introverts and extroverts and things like this, right? So if you have this giant meeting where you bring everybody in and say, all right, we want your feedback, right? You know, the extroverted people may speak up and talk, but there's going to be people in the back like me, right? I'm an introverted person. Odds of me speaking up in that meeting, probably not going to happen. Plus, I like to bring in information and process it and then talk later. So as a leader, you need to pick up on those cues, right? So if you see me in the back and I'm kind of going, right? And I don't, that means you need to circle back with me later and say, hey, Bryan, I saw you in the back there. You look like you had some other thoughts. What were you thinking? Actually, yeah, I did. Let's and you have to create, right? It gets back to what they're talking about here with creating those safe environments to feel that there's no repercussions. And I know in my past, and it's funny when you look at these things too, Austin, you recognize in the past those situations where you should have spoke up and you didn't, right? And people feel guilty about that. And
it's a horrible feeling.
Yeah. And in my mind, so we used to do like product cuttings at the company I was at, right? So we would bring out this big spread of all these different awesome cheeses we made and all these bries and all these things. And the CEO of the company would come to these. And then he would declare what was good and what was bad. And I never said anything. It drove me nuts. Because he's not the arbiter, right? The consumer decides what's the good cheese or not the CEO. He has no qualifications in that area. And I would just kind of go, right? Because in my mind, right, there was a psychological risk to that, right? If I had called him out, he probably wouldn't have liked it. And my career in my mind was now at risk, right? It's like, oh, geez, if I say something, he's going to get mad and, he's going to get me after
right.
that. Is that true or not? Who knows? That doesn't matter, right? The only point that matters is I thought it was true and I didn't speak up.
Right. And then obviously the CEO or the leadership didn't create that environment where you felt that you could comfortably go to the CEO and bring up, a potential objection without this, like, being reprimanded. Yeah. I mean, oh my gosh, we're seeing it. I mean, the fascinating Twitter saga, right now, and what's going on there. That, I mean, wow, that's an amazing case study in psychological safety and creating an environment where people can speak up.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, isn't it, as we analyze it, right? So people at Twitter who thought they were free to say things found out rather rudely that they weren't.
Right.
In the new environment.
But there's a great question here from Felix. And he says, the question remains as to what in reality hinders or negatively disrupts the persistence of this ideal culture, even when it has been engineered and communicated throughout the organization. The answer is that human beings are fallible, weird, take cognitive shortcuts. We're biased. We're opinionated. We lack motivation in some areas. We're highly motivated in others. It comes down to people are an imperfect science. And that's because we can engineer and communicate the stuff, but the complexity comes down to people. And that's why I'm fascinated with food safety culture and trying to figure out these very complex elements around values, beliefs, and norms.
Right.
Because I can tell you what the norm should be, but there's what the norm actually is. And then how do we find out why is that happening? And it's, and rarely does it lead to a very logical conclusion, right?
You don't know the context, right? So let's say that you come into a company and you want to institute, a change in culture and start implementing some of the things that we're talking about today around food safety culture. And let's say the company did this in the past and failed miserably, right? You're being judged by that standard that you don't even know about, right? So everybody is sitting in the back of the hall or whatever, thinking, "Oh yeah, right," and all right, here's the flavor of the month, right? Mm-hmm. We've all heard this before, and you have to number one know about that, right? So somebody's got to let you know, and then you're going to have to fight through it through demonstration, right? And showing people that you're actually applying what you're saying and that it's just not words.
Right. And so that's, and that's what I talk about. Like, I could do an hour-long training on psychological safety, but it's not gonna really move the needle, right? Yeah. That's the cost of entry into creating these new organizational norms. Yeah. So yeah, but it's a great question because it is, and I think that's why the industry as a whole is looking at this topic of food safety culture, because they've been engineering process and procedure. They've been engineering standards, audit schemes, all these other things that hopefully would solve these problems, but they simply just didn't, right? They improved some stuff in certain ways, but it's like we still have recalls. We still have people who aren't speaking up. We still have all these different issues. And I think that's where the industry was like, oh, well, we really haven't addressed the complex human element of the people implementing these processes, right? And that's where these failures begin to happen.
Right.
So the final column, because man, the time is moving.
Why?
A final column is responding productively, right? So this is we're talking about psychological safety, how to create an environment where people feel empowered to speak up when they see an issue. So responding productively as a leader, express appreciation, right? Listen, acknowledge, and thank, right? So imagine, let's go back to your example, right? Yeah. That you had gone to the CEO after that meeting and been like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be relying solely on your opinion of, the cheese as to which one we're going to market and pursue. We have this great research from, I'm always big on like, don't just shoot something down, actually bring a solution when you shoot something down, right? So, I'm sure you would have had a solution in mind. And then the CEO would listen to that, acknowledge what's going on, and thank you for your feedback. Now, he might not implement any change, right? But at least he listened, he acknowledged, and he thanked you for your feedback, right? And that's all that's really needed, right? That's the biggest thing to create that environment, because psychological safety doesn't mean we just do everything that everybody brings to our attention, right? Yeah. We still have boundaries and borders and here's, this is what I believe versus, so, but to actually take the time to listen and not shoot it down immediately, that's a really important element. And then Amazon.
Oh, hold on.
That's the book you ordered.
No, it's actually my dog is getting groomed. I'm going to turn my camera off. Oh, I'm going. Oh my goodness. Let's see. Oh, I'm just going to jump up here. Let me put this back on. Oh, Noodle, come here, baby. Everybody, this is Noodle. Good morning. Oh, that's what you're ready to get before.
Okay, good. This is the last time. Sorry.
Everybody like my shorts?
Man. The Zoom call outfit.
Absolutely. All right, let's see if I can bring back up the graphic here. Oh, full screen. There we go. And let's try and do that. There we go.
Cool. So yeah,
oh my goodness. Yeah.
That is the cutest dog, man. Like a little Ewok.
That he is. So I mean too, right? So on the negative side was that example with my CEO. On the positive side, right, is with Don, the plant manager, right? As you go through these different steps, he followed this exactly, didn't he?
Yeah, he basically did exactly. I mean, he's almost set up that like he is the ideal case study manager because he checks so many of these things off his list.
Right. And I think really, I mean, kind of one of the takeaways from this too is he was a good plant manager, not necessarily because he was the best plant manager, right? With the best yield and efficiencies and downtime and everything else. He was the best plant manager because of the people side of things, right? His team in that plant, they would do anything for him, right? Because they knew that he would do anything for them too, right? And so it was a two-way street, and they knew that he was walking the talk, right?
And that's a great point, because one of the things that Amy points out in her book is that psychological safety lives at the team level, right? So like, you know, the CEO cannot be strictly required or responsible for developing psychological safety. So you think of like your platoon leader, right? Like if I trust my platoon leader, then I will go out and do my best work. But like what the 3-star general thinks, like that's so disconnected from me, right? If I'm infantry. And so, so this psychological safety really lives at this team level of like, really no more than 10 people. And so focusing on those leaders, each one of them doing their part within their individual team, starts to build that psychological safety. So then also, I mean, there's a whole other topic of conversation, but when we talk about silos within organizations and, it's like, well, I have a really great team over here in marketing, but when I go to ops, like they shoot everything down, or they don't want to hear our ideas or whatever. And so it's important, once again, when we talk about the organizational culture, going back to GFSI definition, right? In and throughout the organization. So we've got this is something that has to spread throughout every department, because when these two departments come together, we want to make sure that they have the same norms of behavior and interaction and psychological safety, so that they can share these ideas and collaborate.
I love that. I want to stop you there at that point, because my mind is racing on that. That was an extremely important point, right? So the piece where I was talking about the line worker, right? My job is not to run the machine. My job is to make safe, wholesome food that people will eat and enjoy, right? Now, if you translate that message to the organization, I work in procurement. It's the same message. My job is not to buy the cheapest crap I can find and get my bonus at the end of the year. My job is to buy the things that we need to prepare safe, wholesome food for people, right? That's a complete, right? And pushing that out, to your point, Austin, that's food safety culture. Right?
Yes, that's exactly it. And so that's the shift, is that that's the first priority above everything else. And then, you talked about this, and we talked about it earlier, right? The final thing in this column of responding productively is to destigmatize failure, right? Because like I said, if I bring an issue to you and am shunned for it, or it's like, why didn't you find this earlier? Or like, what's wrong with you? Or, if there's specific punishments, as opposed to an appreciation for, hey, thanks for bringing this to our attention. If you hadn't, who knows how long this would have sat there. The fact is that we did find it. and so destigmatizing that failure so that people aren't intimidated to bring failures to light.
Yeah.
And then through destigmatizing failure, offering them help, right? Because a lot of times we hear that people complain that, well, leadership isn't providing me the necessary assistance or the necessary help that I need to make this thing work properly or to be safe. And then I love this one, discuss, consider, and brainstorm next steps. A lot of times whenever I have a conversation with a company who comes and says, hey, we want to work on food safety culture within our company, that's like such a massive ask, because it encompasses so many different things. So we usually go through like a day-long consulting session to like really identify specifically what is the need within your organization, within your culture, and brainstorming those specific problems, what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past, looking at the overall overarching belief system within it, and like really like just taking a beat and saying, okay, what are we facing here? Because so much is just kind of knee-jerk reaction. It's like we had this thing, now bam, we need to do this, and so it's constantly just putting out fires, as opposed to taking a moment or taking time to say, well, how can we improve this? How can we make this better? And then creating that list. And this is something that we did out in Dubai as part of our workshop. And because this is a skill that I think as we get older, it gets harder and harder to think creatively, right? Because we become very fixated and like, this is my knowledge. It's like you think about like a PhD, right? Like someone who has a PhD, they are hyper specific piece of knowledge within a niche within a niche within a niche, right? And so it becomes harder to see things outside of that worldview that you have. So I think flexing that muscle consistently with the team and creating that environment where you can brainstorm, throw out bad ideas and not have any judgment over them. It's like, let's just get it all out, because who knows what will come out of this and how we can improve our process.
Right. Well, and part of this too, right, is to, and especially at the senior level, right, as you're kind of looking at this process and figuring out how can we implement these type of actions that we're learning here today, is some people are harder to convince than others, or some people might even think that this isn't a good use of time, right? We're here to work and this is all a bunch of fluffy, right? And there may be a senior leader who directly or unconsciously, they don't even realize that they're doing it, are sabotaging this, right? Because it's just as simple, right, as I have an open door policy, come to my office anytime, right? And if you come in my office, Austin, and the first thing you see is me go like this, right? Done. It's done, right? And then you're sitting in the office going, gosh, why is everybody not doing this, right? And behind the scenes they're saying, it's because of you, right? and we have these blind spots we don't even necessarily know, right, that we're doing these things. And it may be that I'm not even thinking about what you were actually talking about when it came in the office. Let's just say I got a call and I just found out my teenage son got in a car wreck, right? And he goobered up the company, the family car, and I'm thinking about the punishment that's going to be appropriate when I get home, right? And that's what I'm thinking about, right? And so, and this gets back to what you were talking about earlier, right? And what Felix was talking about, and that's why this is so challenging, right? Is we're not dealing with systems and procedures. We're dealing with people, right? And everybody is unique, and you need to take that into account. And that's why I really like this frame, right? And it's interesting for me. Everything comes back to plan, do, check, act, right? It's that basic building block of quality. And I'm always amazed how many different places it applies. That's kind of what we're talking about here, right? Is you put together a plan, you execute that plan, you check to see if that plan is working correctly. And if it's not, you course correct or you modify that plan and you start over, right? This is the conversation you're having with people.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and so, yeah, if you want to go back to the first slide, since we're kind of getting close to the wrap up, I want to try to pull this all together. So basically everything that we just covered is the toolkit to help people answer these questions in the affirmative, right? How do we create the culture where people feel empowered and psychologically safe enough to speak up whenever they see a particular issue. And so those questions were, does the situation require action? And as you could see from all the modeling that we just talked about, the leadership modeling before, if all of that is done, then they should feel competent enough to be able to say, yes, this situation definitely requires action. And then the most complicated one, is it my personal responsibility to act? By all those things that we just went through around Amy Edmondson's model of creating a psychologically safe workforce, they will be able to answer, yes, it is my personal responsibility to act because I know what is at stake. I know my role within the company. I know what our overall mission is. And I know that if I say something, there will not be a negative repercussion. I'll actually be rewarded in some way for bringing this to light.
Yeah.
And then the final, and this is, the final one is the easiest. Should I take action now or later, right? Is this so egregious that I need to do something now, or do I do it later? Because it's not quite as intense as, shutting everything down on the spot.
Right. Well, and the thing is too, right, is the other side of this pendulum, right, where people overreact to things doesn't happen, right? That's something that we're not wired to do. Joe has a question for you, Austin. When assessing company culture, is it helpful to benchmark versus competitors to support that change?
It's a great question. So there's a lot of, I'll give you my gut reaction. My gut reaction is no. But I always try to think about why I think about what I think. Because every company is different in its own way. It's specific product, its process, what their goals are. So, like I think about marriage, right? Like I like the way that our marriage is structured. Christina and myself. I could look at other married couples and be like, well, that's good or that's bad, or I want to borrow that thing, or that I definitely don't want to do that. So there's learning opportunities through other cultures, but it's hard to compare two companies exactly, right? It's not always apples and apples,
right?
But I think there's a lot of learning that can come from seeing where other companies are having struggles and where they're really excelling.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like even if you have within the same company two plants that are making the same products and have pretty much the same equipment, the end product is going to be different, right? It always happens. It's a unique thing. And even within particular market segments for companies, right? A French food company is going to manage these questions very differently than an American food company, right? You have a different cultural bias coming in of how the people in that culture react to those type of things. Now imagine a company with blended, right? So you've got some French people and Italians and Spanish and Americans or whatever working in the company. Now the complexity just went up.
Yeah.
Geometrically.
And this is where we even get into like culture from plant to plant, culture from country to country. Look at the case study of Walmart going into Germany, and like they made it for about 8 or 9 years, and then finally had to pull out. There was a cultural clash there. So even though it was the Walmart culture, that didn't completely align with the German culture. And so there's just so many variables at play.
Yeah.
So I would say, like Joe, like it's worthwhile to look at and measure, look at what other companies are doing, but I wouldn't utilize that as the high water mark, because every company is individual and unique in its own way. So you got to find like what fits for you.
Exactly. And back to our earlier example, we're seeing real world playing out in front of our eyes with Twitter, right? So Elon's idea of what the culture should be versus the company's idea of what it was. And within the company right now, you're also talking, right? So we were talking different countries and different cultural viewpoints. Age, right? Age gives different viewpoints as well, right? So you have to, all of the age, man, is this complex. Holy moly.
Yeah.
So Felix has a good point here. And wow, we're out of time here. We need to wrap this up.
Yeah.
So Bryan and Austin, a white paper does not and will not do this for any organization. Agree. This culture thing is also more complex than the general tendency to set aside inevitable variables. You need to pay attention to all these, and at play cannot be overemphasized. Yep. So yeah, good comments there. Relative to that, right? Yeah. So I mean, is this something that you're going to fix overnight? No, right? This is why we all struggle with this, right? Is part of this, and this is where the technical side of our brain takes over, right? Is, all right, we'll write a food safety procedure. Ain't going to happen. Ain't going to happen, right? You need to implement these type of things, and you need to talk about it with other people, right? Which is why with the group I put together on locals is you need to be able to, pull different tools depending on what situation you're in, and figuring these things out of what is correct to apply to you, because you have all these variables that you have in place that may be right for you, may not be right for you. Fascinating. Any closing comments, Austin, or anything you'd like to leave people with?
No, I would say if you found some value in this, I would definitely check out Amy's book. There's a lot of great stuff in it. And if you have any questions about this, I love chatting about it. So feel free to send me an email. It's austin@sage.media.
Yep, absolutely. And I think too, right, this is kind of overlays with what we were talking about with blind spots, right? Having people who can come into your organization and give that outside perspective, immensely valuable, right? Because there's no fear of repercussion, right? If someone hires you, Austin, to come in and evaluate their culture, that's your task and that's the assignment and that's what you're charged with doing. And you can hit them between the eyes and say, here's what I'm seeing that you probably don't see. And that's not their fault. It's just, we all have our blind spots. So
it's great to find companies who are open to that, that feedback, because that's usually what exactly happens.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have one, right? That old saying. So great way to end. Everybody, thank you very much. And we love these chats and the community we're building here, right? This is culture too, right? What we're doing here, right? Sharing and learning and growing and identifying these things. And again, right, part of what I always look at when I attend a course or go to a conference or something like that, if I'm able to bring one thing out of that and bring it back and execute against that, that's a success, right? So if you can look at things that way, that's the best way to do it, because you just can't say, okay, Monday I'm going to have food safety culture. Never, ever going to happen, right?
Right.
And you're going to crash and burn like nobody's business. So little steps, work with other people, join groups like locals and shows like this so that we can help each other out. So with that, we'll close on today. I'd love to keep going on this, but we have to close. We'll see you back here next week, hopefully not snowy. And yes, we will have a food safety chat the day after Thanksgiving. So if you're digesting your turkey and you're recovering from all the football games and everything else, join us, right? Learn a little bit about food safety and culture and all these fascinating things that we talk about. And again, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I know Austin does as well. So everybody, enjoy your weekend. I got a little bit of extra snow scooping out there, and Noodle will be nice and pretty. And believe it or not, he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the snow, which is amazing, right? A little guy like that, he doesn't even care. So
awesome.
Excellent.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks. Have a great one. Thank you again, everybody. And we'll see you back here next week.
Awesome.